Welcome everyone to the Mysteries Abound podcast. This is your host Paul, and this is episode 67. This show is entitled El Dorado, the truth behind the myth. But to begin today's show, something from thelistfirst.com. 10 Lies Taught to Us in School by Andrew Handley. The school system is a bastion of education and enlightenment, a fortress of higher learning where our children can safely discover the facts about the way our world works. Through this system, we have the opportunity to grow and mature into responsible adults, secure in our knowledge of history, science and mathematics. Except, of course, for all the ridiculously irresponsible lies we're being fed. Here are 10 of the biggest lies taught to us in school. Number 10. Deoxygenated blood is blue, which is why your veins appear blue. If you look closely at the inside of your wrist, you'll probably see a small network of blue veins running up into your hand. Despite what they might teach you in elementary school, that's not blue blood running through there. The myth is that deoxygenated blood is blue, while blood leaving the heart is red because it's been filled with fresh oxygen. When you bleed, the blood is immediately red because it's exposed to oxygen in the air. But if you've ever given blood or had blood taken at the doctor's office, you'll know that it's not some alien blue liquid filling up that sealed tube. It's blood. The reason your veins look blue is a simple trick of the light and the way your eyes perceive colours. When light filters through the layers of skin, the low-frequency wavelengths, like red, are refracted by pigmentation and thin fat layers, leaving mostly blue light to reflect back to your eyes. An albino person will usually have red veins because of the lack of pigmentation in their skin. Number 9. There were 13 original colonies in America. It's easy to understand why people believe this lie, but it is a lie nonetheless. The American flag has 13 stripes, representing the original 13 colonies. But really, there were only 12. That's because Delaware was never a separate colony. After the British invaded the region and stole it from the Dutch in the 1660s, the Delaware Territory was juggled between Maryland and Pennsylvania. Eventually it ended up under the ownership of William Penn, the guy who also owned Pennsylvania, and it remained a part of Pennsylvania until the Revolutionary War. In fact, it wasn't even called Delaware. It was just known as the 3 lower counties. Number 8. Liquid glass. The myth: old window panes are thicker at the bottom because glass is a slow-moving liquid. At some point in time, an historian looked at an ancient window pane and noticed something unusual. The glass was thicker at the bottom than at the top. Since there was no other way to account for it, he came to the conclusion that glass was an extremely slow-moving liquid that settled over the years, resulting in thin brittle glass at the top that gradually thickened towards the bottom edge of the window pane. And then everybody believed him. The myth spread until even college professors were teaching it in their classes, since even scientists don't understand science sometimes. But one researcher recently decided to test the viscosity or rate of flow of glass and came to the result that even the least viscous type of glass wouldn't change much in a time span about 3 times the length of the existence of the universe. Though why we should believe him more than the first scientist is a bit of a mystery. Effectively, they are both making it up. The real reason antique glass windows are bottom-heavy goes back to the way they were made in the Middle Ages. Window makers would blow glass into a large sphere, then flatten it into a disc by spinning it. The spinning motion caused the edge of the disc to thicken, much like a spinning pizza dough, and when they cut the disc into windows, they placed the thicker side at the bottom for stability. Number 7. Europeans invaded Africa and kidnapped the slaves. This isn't meant to trivialise slavery, or pardon any of the people who took part in it, or condone it in any way. But let's face it, most Americans are under the impression that colonial-era slavery got its start with white people sailing over to Africa, kidnapping hundreds of thousands of people and bringing them back to Europe and America in chains. Parts of that are true. There were a lot of chains and many Africans were certainly kidnapped. But despite the picture painted by many history textbooks, the majority of those slaves were actually sold to Europeans by other African slave traders who had been operating on the continent for thousands of years. Slavery is nothing new to the world. It was actually pretty normal around that time. In fact, Egyptians were using Caucasian slaves in their armies during the 13th century. Heck, even the Bible endorsed the practice. As far as the Atlantic slave trade was concerned, in-country African slaves were typically members of a defeated tribe. But as soon as slave traders realised that Europeans would pay for their slaves, they actively began kidnapping people just to sell them on the Nigerian coast. And speaking of lies about slavery, number 6, Abraham Lincoln was strongly opposed to slavery. Abraham Lincoln is often put on a pedestal as one of the greatest opponents of slavery for freeing the slaves with his Emancipation Proclamation in 1862. In fact, he struggled with conflicting and ambiguous views on slavery during his entire presidential career. He wasn't a stalwart supporter of abolition. He only wanted to do what would make the Union stronger. Remember, this was a time when the Confederate States had split from the Union and were at war. In his own words, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the coloured race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union." This is called talking out of both sides of your mouth. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't really touch on racial equality or human rights. It was a wartime decision, as a fit and necessary military measure. All persons held as slaves in the Confederate States will thenceforth be free. In other words, only the enemy's slaves were freed. Hooray to the great emancipator. Let's face it, if Honest Abe really wanted equality, Martin Luther King probably wouldn't have a holiday named after him. Number 5. Diamonds are made from coal. If you believe that diamonds are made from highly compressed coal, don't worry, so does everyone else. But it's completely false. Diamonds are found in vertical shafts filled with rocks formed by volcanoes, while coal is mainly found among other types of rocks, like limestone and shale. Coal is almost never found in the same type of environment as diamonds. Coal is formed near the surface from plant matter, while diamonds are formed in the Earth's mantle, over 90 miles closer to the core, and then carried up to the crust during volcanic eruptions. It's true that diamonds are formed from carbon by intense heat, 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, and high pressure, but it's unlikely that the carbon comes from coal. So while the idea of a lump of coal becoming a beautiful diamond makes a pretty picture, it's still one big spoonful of lies. On the other hand, modern science can pretty much turn anything into a diamond in the lab. Number 4. The Founding Fathers were all Christian. One of the prevailing myths taught in history classes is that the Founding Fathers of America were all Christian. The Declaration of Independence talks about God. The Pledge of Allegiance, which incidentally wasn't even created until more than a century later, uses the words, "under God." And it all sort of jumbles together into the idea that Washington and crew were Bible-thumping Christian men. Well, they weren't. For starters, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin were both believed to be deists who don't follow the Bible explicitly, but assume there's a God because nature is so great. George Washington most likely followed pantheism, which is the belief that nature is God. John Adams was a Unitarian, an offshoot of Christianity that believes Jesus was a great guy, but not God's son. Alexander Hamilton was a typical Christian, but only later in life, after his son was killed. Number 3. Van Gogh cut off his own ear. If you ask a random person to describe Vincent van Gogh, they're more likely to tell you he cut off his ear and mailed it to his girlfriend. None of that ever happened, but the truth is probably even more gruesome. The new theory on Van Gogh's ear is that it was sliced off by his fellow painter Paul Gauguin during a fight. After looking through old records and letters from Van Gogh, historian Hans Kaufmann believes that the two painters got into a scuffle during which Van Gogh threw a wine glass at his friend. Gauguin responded by unsheathing his sword, as you do, and sliced off Van Gogh's ear. He then made up the entire story of Van Gogh going mad so that he wouldn't be arrested. Number 2. Humans evolved from apes. In this scenario, Christians have it right, but not the way they think. Early classes on evolution usually leave one basic impression. Humans evolved from apes. Go to a zoo and you can watch your genetic ancestors frolicking and flinging poop at each other. But that's not the way it happened. After all, evolution works by eliminating the inferior species, while the stronger, better adapted ones thrive. If that had happened, then there wouldn't be any apes left, because we would have outcompeted them. The more likely theory is that humans and the great apes, chimpanzees, gorillas and orangutans, started with a common ancestor, and then evolved in separate directions over the years. Specifically 4, 8 and 12 million years ago, respectively. And it's still happening, in the animal kingdom at least. Researchers believe that less than 1 million years ago, the eastern and western gorillas parted evolutionary ways and are now developing in different directions. And finally, number 1. Thanksgiving. All of it. Here's the lie. Pilgrims on the Mayflower arrived at Plymouth Rock in 1620. Unprepared for the harsh winter, they were saved by the friendly natives who gave them food and taught them how to plant corn. The following autumn, on their first harvest in the New World, they had a feast to commemorate the hardships they had survived, and Pilgrim and Native Americans joined hands in celebration. The real story is a touch more cruel, murderous and genocidal. 3 years before the Pilgrims arrived, European fishermen and settlers had introduced a plague that had swept through the tribes of coastal New England and wiped out nearly 96% of the entire population. There were reportedly so many bodies that settlers would leave the towns rather than deal with them, only to introduce the bug to the next tribe they encountered. One report from a man named Howard Simpson stated, "Villages lay in ruins because there was no one to tend them. The ground was strewn with skulls and the bones of thousands of Indians who had died, and none was left to bury them." There's also evidence that the Pilgrims already knew about the plague and so chose Cape Cod, because they knew that the Indians had already been wiped out, leaving cleared lands and cornfields ripe for the taking. Even worse, the Pilgrims would steal food and tools from any Indians left alive who were too weak to fight back. But the settlers in Virginia were actually eating the Indians, so I guess the Pilgrims weren't that bad by comparison. Yes, I did say eating them. And to one of the great mysteries of the world, especially if you're a male. From the www.lifeslittlemysteries.com website, a new theory on why men love breasts. And it's written by Natalie Walchover. Why do straight men devote so much headspace to those big bulbous bags of fat drooping from women's chests? Scientists have never satisfactorily explained men's curious breast fixation, but now a neuroscientist has struck upon an explanation that he says just makes a lot of sense. Larry Young, a professor of psychiatry at Emory University, who studies the neurological basis of complex social behaviours, thinks human evolution has harnessed an ancient neural circuit that originally evolved to strengthen the mother-infant bond during breastfeeding, and now uses this brain circuitry to strengthen the bond between couples as well. The result? Men, like babies, love breasts. When a woman's nipples are stimulated during breastfeeding, the neurochemical oxytocin, otherwise known as the love drug, floods her brain, helping to focus her attention and affection on her baby. But research over the past few years has shown that in humans, this circuitry isn't reserved for exclusive use by infants. Recent studies have found that nipple stimulation enhances sexual arousal in the great majority of women, and it activates the same brain areas as vaginal and clitoral stimulation. When a sexual partner touches, massages or nibbles a woman's breasts, Young said, this triggers the release of oxytocin in the woman's brain, just like what happens when a baby nurses. But in this context, the oxytocin focuses the woman's attention on her sexual partner, strengthening her desire to bond with this person. In other words, men can make themselves more desirable by stimulating a woman's breasts during foreplay and sex. Evolution has, in a sense, made men want to do this. Attraction to breasts is a brain organisation effect that occurs in straight males when they go through puberty. Young told Life's Little Mysteries. Evolution has selected for this brain organisation in men that makes them attracted to the breasts in a sexual context, because the outcome is that it activates the female bonding circuit, making women feel more bonded with him. It's a behaviour that males have evolved in order to stimulate the female's maternal bonding circuitry. So why did this evolutionary change happen in humans and not in other breastfeeding mammals? Young thinks it's because we form monogamous relationships, whereas 97% of mammals do not. Secondly, it might have to do with the fact that we are upright and have face-to-face sex, which provides more opportunity for nipple stimulation during sex. In monogamous voles, for example, the nipples are hanging toward the ground, and the voles mate from behind, so this didn't evolve, he said. So maybe the nature of our sexuality has allowed greater access to the breasts. Young said competing theories of men's breast fixation doesn't stand up to scrutiny. For example, the argument that men tend to select full-breasted women because they think these women's breast fat will make them better at nourishing babies falls short when one considers that sperm is cheap compared with eggs, and men don't need to be choosy. But Young's new theory will face scrutiny of its own. Commenting on the theory, Rutgers University anthropologist Fran Macielese, who has written extensively about the evolutionary role of breasts, said one concern is that not all men are attracted to them. Always important whenever evolutionary biologists suggest a universal reason for a behaviour and emotion. How about the cultural differences? Macielese wrote in an email. In some African cultures, for example, women don't cover their breasts, and men don't seem to find them so, shall we say, titillating? Young says that just because breasts aren't covered in these cultures doesn't mean that massaging them and stimulating them is not part of the foreplay in these cultures. As of yet, there are not many studies that look at breast stimulation during foreplay in an anthropological context, he said. Young elaborates on his theory of breast love and other neurological aspects of human sexuality in a new book, The Chemistry Between Us, co-authored by Brian Alexander. And for those listeners who let their younger family members listen to the podcast, you may want to skip the next story as well, just in case you have too many questions to answer after the last story. From the www.slate.com website, how did humans figure out that sex makes babies? And this is an answer to one of the Explainer's 2012 runner-up questions of the year. And it's written by J. Brian Lauder. When the Explainer asked you to vote on a favourite unanswered question of 2012, the majority opted for rather a lascivious query regarding why rich ladies sunbathe topless, and the Explainer has duly delivered your pound of flesh. But in perusing the runners-up, another question so intrigued the Explainer that he could not resist answering it as well. When and how did humankind figure out that sex is what causes babies? It's not exactly the most obvious correlation. Sex doesn't always lead to babies, and there's a long lead time between the act and the consequences. Weeks before there are even symptoms usually. So, roughly, where do we think we were as a species when it clicked? Basically, since the beginning. While anthropologists and evolutionary biologists can't be precise, all available evidence suggests that humans have understood that there is some relationship between copulation and childbirth since Homo sapiens first exhibited greater cognitive development, sometime between the emergence of our species 200,000 years ago and the elaboration of human culture probably about 50,000 years ago. Material evidence for this knowledge is thin, but one plaque from the Cuddlehoyuk archaeological site seems to demonstrate a Neolithic understanding, with two figures embracing on one side and a mother and child depicted on the other. A firmer conclusion can be drawn from the fact that though explanations for conception vary wildly across contemporary cultural groups, everyone acknowledges at least a partial link between sex and babies. As for how humans attained what biological anthropologist Holly Dunsworth calls reproductive consciousness, that part is murkier. Most likely we got the gist from observing animal reproduction cycles and generally noting that women who do not sleep with men do not get pregnant. But that doesn't mean that early peoples, or for that matter modern people, thought or think of the process in the utilitarian sperm meet eggs way that the scientifically literate do now. Around the turn of the 20th century, anthropologists working in places such as Australia and New Guinea reported that their subjects did not recognise a connection between sex and children. However, subsequent research has shown these biased reports to be only half true at best. For example, Bronislaw Malinowski claimed in 1927 that for Trobriand Islanders, the father played no role in producing a child. But later anthropologists studying the same group learned that semen was believed to be necessary for the coagulation of menstrual blood, the stoppage of which was thought to eventually form the fetus. Even though the Trobriand Islanders' traditional explanations of conception seem quaint or strange, they do on some level recognise the tie between sex and childbirth. And of course, before we Westerners get to feeling all superior, it must be said that our notions of conception are not wholly consistent or rational either. The number of unplanned pregnancies in the United States reveals as much. As women's studies scholar Cynthia Ella points out, while other events may also be necessary, such as the entrance of a spirit child through the top of the head, in the case of the Trobriand Islanders, or the entrance of a soul into a fertilised egg, in the case of Roman Catholics, it is simply not believed that women bear children without any male participation whatsoever. If we humans have essentially always kind of understood that the deed leads to the delivery room, did that knowledge have any consequences on our evolution as a society? Holly Dunsworth argues that, of the entire animal world, reproductive consciousness is unique to humans. That special knowledge may help to explain both the evolution of our taboos around sex and our ability to bend nature's procreative capacities to our favour in everything from dog breeding to family planning. Just moving away now from stories about sex and just reflecting upon that at my age, I was amazed that I could keep my interest that long. In the stories, that is. To one of the unsolved mysteries from my childhood. Two of my favourite characters were Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner in the Looney Tunes cartoons. And I never knew the answer to this question until now. Where did the Looney Tunes Acme Corporation come from? And this is an article by Matt Soniak at the mentalfloss.com website. Rita Bryan wants to know, why is Acme the stock company name used in cartoons and other pop culture? The Acme Corporation is a mysterious conglomerate that appears to make every product imaginable, from rocket-powered roller skates to dehydrated boulders, across several fictional universes. It's a ubiquitous go-to name for cartoons, thanks largely to its repeated use in the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote segments of Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies, but also the name of plenty of reputable, real-world businesses. Acme isn't a made-up word or a jokey acronym, but comes from the Greek acne, the highest point or peak, and often used to mean the best of a category. Its heavy use in cartoons comes from its popularity as a name in the era when the Yellow Pages and other alphabetized phone directories became common. We'll turn it over to Chuck Jones, who worked as an animator, writer and director on Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies cartoons for some 30 years, to explain it a little more. He said in interviews for the 2009 short documentary Chuck Jones, Memories of Childhood. Since we had to search out our own entertainment, we devised our own fairy stories. If you wanted a bow and arrow, you got a stick. If you wanted to conduct an orchestra, you got a stick. If you wanted a duel, you got a stick. You couldn't go and buy one. That's where the term Acme came from. Whenever we played a game where we had a grocery store or something, we called it the Acme Corporation. Why? Because in the Yellow Pages, if you looked, say, under drugstores, you'd find the first one would be called Acme Drugs. Why? Because Ac was about as high as you could go. It means the best, the superlative. And you can check out all things Acme in the Looney Tunes universe anyway at the original illustrated catalogue of Acme products. And if you visit the show notes at www.origins.info, click on the link to the Mysteries Abound podcast show notes and on the link to episode 67 and then on the link to this article. If you go to the bottom of the article, there is the link to that catalogue of Acme products. Episode 67 of the Mysteries Abound podcast has answered so far many of the deep universal mysteries. And here's another one. Sweet potatoes. One of my favourite vegetables. Polynesians reached South America, picked up sweet potatoes, went home. From the Ars Technica website, an article by John Trimmer. The sweet potato was one of a number of crops domesticated in the Andes, and like many of the rest, it became a global crop in the colonial era. But there were some hints that the sweet potato may have already started its global sweep before the Europeans ever took a bite out of one. Some of the early European explorers, including Captain Cook, reported finding it in places like Hawaii, all of which implies that the Polynesians, who managed to spread widely across the Pacific, had made it all the way to South America. But it was difficult to be sure, given that European travellers later enhanced its spread within the Pacific and elsewhere. This has also created a complex genetic legacy that obscures its origins. Now researchers have gone back and obtained DNA from museum samples, including some collected by Cook's crew, and find that the DNA indicates that Polynesians made it as far as South America. Archaeological remains appear to place sweet potato cultivation in the core of Polynesia by the year 1200, and it spread with further migrations to places like New Zealand and Hawaii. It's possible that the plant had naturally spread as seeds across the ocean, and the Polynesians learned to cultivate it independently. One of the arguments against this is the fact that the Polynesian terms for the crop appear to be closely related to its name in Quechua, the language of the Peruvian Andes. Kumala and its derivative Kumara and relatives. That and the fact that the Polynesians made it most of the way across the Pacific, clearly getting as far as Easter Island, still reaching South America and then returning with crops is quite a significant step beyond that. Trying to piece together a model of the sweet potato spread based on things like historical reports, known human travels and genetic information, however, has been quite a mess. Even the simplest ideas that are consistent with the data involve the sweet potato entering the Pacific through 3 different routes, and then potentially hybridizing with the strains already in existence. It may be complicated, but the new genetic study provides support for this 3-pronged assault on the Pacific. The researchers start with a detailed study of the cultivars found in South America, Central America and the Caribbean. The researcher team based in France found that there are 2 distinct populations, a northern strain found in Mexico and the Caribbean, and a southern one in the Andes, where the crop was first domesticated. There's also a region of overlap and intermingling between the 2. Genetic relatives of the northern strain entered the Pacific via 2 routes. In the first, trade with the Philippines during the Spanish colonial era brought it there. From that site, it diffused into mainland Asia and to some island strains. But the Caribbean strain made its way across the Atlantic, through Madagascar and into Indonesia. Its arrival, likely in the 1700s, transformed the agriculture of the New Guinea highlands, which had previously been focused on taro. Cultural changes followed in its wake. Most modern cultivars are descended from some combination of these 2 invasions. But samples from museums, including some collected by the earliest European voyagers, showed that this wasn't likely to be the case prior to the late 1800s. Before then, most strains were spread directly from initial sources with very little interbreeding. The other thing that museum samples indicate is that prior to extensive European travels in the Pacific, there was another, genetically distinct form of the sweet potato present in eastern Polynesia. And that appears to have originated from the southern population focused in the Andes. It was already present in Polynesia before colonists left this region to settle in Hawaii and New Zealand. Given that we already know Polynesians had the technology to engage in long-distance voyages across the Pacific, the simplest explanation for this is that they did make it to South America, probably somewhere around the year 1000. And most strikingly, some of them apparently turned around and travelled back halfway across the Pacific. This, combined with evidence that travellers from India made it to Australia over 4,000 years ago, provides impressive evidence of just how mobile some of our ancestors must have been. And they managed to travel all that distance with technologies we generally consider primitive. But it's important to consider that just because you wouldn't hop into an open canoe and head out into the Pacific, it wouldn't have meant certain death for anyone with the right skills. From the www.unexplainedmysteries.com website, an article by Paul Dale Roberts. Werewolves of Wisconsin. Greg Posada and Eugene Pointer of Shawano County, Wisconsin, called the Paranormal Hotline with their report of 2 werewolves seen near Grass Lake on January 9, 2013. They claim that these 2 creatures that appeared to be werewolves were definitely bipedal. One of the creatures had greyish hair, while the other had brownish hair. Both creatures had snouts. When the creatures were observed, they both seemed to be bent down drinking water from the lake. Eugene and Greg both claim that the creatures sniffed the air and then turned and looked at them. They let off a howl that sounded like a regular wolf and ran off into the nearby thickets. The encounter occurred around 1400 hours, and Eugene and Greg were both shaken from this encounter. Greg says that the brown-coated creature was at least 7 feet tall, while the grey-coated creature was perhaps 6 feet tall. Eugene says that this is not the end of the story. After their encounter with the werewolves, it was no more than 10 minutes later they spied a silver disc in the surrounding forest. The silver disc was hovering, tilted, and then shot up into the sky. The sighting of the disc only lasted about 3 minutes, but during the time of the sighting everything felt surreal. Everything moved in slow motion. Eugene and Greg felt relaxed and at ease while they watched the disc in the sky. Eugene does not understand how they could have had 2 paranormal encounters in one day. Special note: Bigfoot on many occasions has been associated with the sightings of UFOs. Could Wisconsin werewolves also have a connection to UFOs? I would definitely say it's possible. The surreal effect that Eugene describes sounds like the Oz factor, or aka the Oz effect. Oz factor is a term invented by Randalls in 1983 to describe the strange, seemingly altered state of consciousness experienced by some witnesses of unidentified flying objects. Randalls has noted the strange calmness and lack of panic described by the witnesses relative to the bizarre circumstances that they described, and says that they described and defined the Oz factor as the sensation of being isolated or transported from the real world into a different environmental framework, where reality is but slightly different. The Oz factor is associated with the fairy tale land of Oz, as in The Wizard of Oz. When Greg and Eugene were describing their encounter, they were very excited in telling their story. Werewolves have been seen in Wisconsin for a long, long time. The first sighting occurred in 1936. The witness, Mark Shackelman, said he encountered a talking wolfman. The wolfman was seen east of Jefferson, Wisconsin, on Highway 18. Mark was driving along the road when he saw a strange figure digging in an old Indian mound. He looked closer and saw that the figure was quite odd. This figure was fully covered with hair and stood erect. It was more than 6 feet tall. This peculiar figure had a muzzle and resembled a dog, but also could have resembled an ape. The hands on this creature were misshapen, with a twisted thumb and 3 fully formed fingers. The beast gave off a putrid smell that was like decaying meat. In another note, Bigfoot is also known to have a putrid smell. Dennis Fewlis in 1964 encountered werewolves just 2 miles away from the Mark Shackelman sighting. Fewlis was driving home around midnight from his job at the Admiral Television Corporation in Harvard, Illinois. After turning onto Highway 89 from Highway 14, his headlights caught an animal running across the road in front of him. It was a dark brown in colour, and he estimated that it weighed between 400 and 500 pounds. He also described it as being 7 or 8 feet tall. It ran across the highway, jumped a barbed wire fence, and vanished. Fewlis returned to the spot in daylight hours to look for footprints or other evidence, but the hard, sun-dried ground offered nothing. They did find where the corn had been pushed aside as the beast entered the field, though. I was awful scared that night, Fulis told author J. Rath. That was no man. It was all hairy from head to feet. Werewolves have been seen in Wisconsin for a long, long time. The sightings keep moving along, all the way to present times. From 1972 sightings in Jefferson County to the Bray Road Beast sighting in October 31st, 1999 by Dorothy Gibson of Elkhorn. Werewolves have been with us for a long, long time. The first documented werewolf attack was in Germany in 1591. Dogs were set upon a wolf that turned out to be a man named Peter Stubb. He was tortured until he confessed to the murder of 16 people. He even confessed to murdering his own son in his thirst for human flesh, and was put to death. Wolves have been both feared and worshipped by past civilizations. The ancient Egyptians feared the wolf god Apuat, who was associated with the Lord of the Dead. Ancient Greeks believed that wolves were sacred to Apollo and Ares, and a bronze statue of a wolf ornamented the oracle at Delphi. The legend of the founding of Rome is well known, with the abandoned twin babies, Romulus and Remus, being saved and succoured by a wolf. Being suckled by a wolf is a notion that persisted into Celtic civilizations. A legendary king of Ireland supposedly nurtured in this way. One Irish tribe claimed to be descended from a wolf. Stories of werewolves go back to ancient Roman times. King Arcadia was known to shape-shift from a man to a wolf. King Arcadia was cursed with lycanthropy because he was trying to trick the god Jupiter into eating human flesh. Werewolves may originate from the fungus called ergo. This fungus would frequently affect the grains that were used to make bread throughout Europe for many centuries. Ergo is well known for its hallucinogenic properties. In a modern case in France in 1951, over 100 people suffered from ergo poisoning after eating bread made from infected rye. Many of them suffered from hallucinations about being attacked by werewolves or turning into werewolves. Such poisoning could have been another cause for the development of the werewolf myth. Other possibilities are diseases like rabies and porphyria. Rabies only lasts for a short while once the symptoms have developed, and then the victim dies. Rabies might have caused the victims to briefly take on the appearance of a mad beast, but they would not have lived long enough to cause a spree of attacks. Porphyria, if untreated, leads to extreme sensitivity to light and degradation of the skin, thus producing a victim who rarely ventures out before nightfall and whose physical appearance is sinister. Maybe this is where the vampire legend comes from. Mental disturbances accompany the physical symptoms. This disease is also genetic and therefore could have given rise to the notion of cursed families, as it often does not manifest until an age whereby the victim would have reproduced. Well, as you can see, the werewolf legend is still persistent even into modern times. What did Eugene and Greg see at Shawano County? The dream of El Dorado, a lost city of gold, led many a conquistador on a fruitless trek into the rainforests and mountains of South America. But it was all wishful thinking. The Golden One was actually not a place, but a person, as recent archaeological research confirms. From the bbc.co.uk website, an article by Dr. Jaco Cooper. El Dorado, the truth behind the myth. Columbus's arrival in the Americas in AD 1492 was the first chapter in a world-changing clash of cultures. It was a brutal confrontation of completely opposing ways of living and systems of beliefs. The European myth that arose around El Dorado as a lost city of gold waiting for discovery by an adventurous conqueror encapsulates the Europeans' endless thirst for gold and their unerring drive to exploit these new lands for their monetary value. The South American myth of El Dorado, on the other hand, reveals the true nature of the territory and the people who live there. For them, El Dorado was never a place, but a ruler so rich that he allegedly covered himself in gold from head to toe each morning and washed it off in a sacred lake each evening. The real story behind the myth has slowly been pieced together over recent years using a combination of early historical texts and new archaeological research. At its heart is a true story of a rite of passage ceremony carried out by the Muisca peoples who have lived in central Colombia from AD 800 to the modern day. Different Spanish chroniclers arrived in this alien continent in the early 16th century and began to write about this ceremony of El Dorado, and one of the best accounts comes from Juan Rodriguez Fraile. In Fraile's book, The Conquest and Discovery of the New Kingdom of Granada, published in 1636, he tells us that when a leader died within Muisca society, the process of succession for the chosen Golden One would unfold. The selected new leader of the community, commonly the nephew of the previous chief, would go through a long initiation process, culminating in the final act of paddling out onto a raft, onto a sacred lake, such as Lake Guatavita in central Colombia. Surrounded by the 4 highest priests adorned with feathers, gold crowns and body ornaments, the leader, naked but for a covering of gold dust, would set out to make an offering of gold objects, emeralds and other precious objects to the gods by throwing them into the lake. The shores of the circular lake were filled with richly adorned spectators, playing musical instruments and burning fires that almost blocked out the daylight from this crucible-like lake basin. The raft itself had 4 burning fires on it, throwing up plumes of incense into the sky. When at the very centre of the lake, the priest would raise a flag to draw silence from the crowd. This moment would mark the point at which the crowds would commit allegiance to their new leader by shouting their approval from the lake shore. Fascinatingly, many of the aspects of this interpretation of events have been validated by painstaking archaeological research that also reveals the exceptional skill and scale of gold production in Colombia at the time of European arrival in 1537. Within Muisca society, gold, or the more specifically an alloy of gold, silver and copper called tambaga, was highly sought after, not for its material value, but for its spiritual power and its connection to the deities, and its ability to bring balance and harmony within Muisca society. As Muisca descendant Enrique Gonzalez explains, gold does not symbolize prosperity to his people. For the Muisca of today, just as for our ancestors, gold is nothing more than an offering. Gold does not represent wealth to us. Recent research by Maria Alicia Urbay Villegas from the Museo del Oro in Bogota and Marcos Martinon Torres from the UCL Institute of Archaeology has shown that within Muisca society, these gold objects were made specifically for immediate use as offerings to the gods to encourage them to balance the equilibrium of the cosmos and to ensure a stable relationship within their environment. According to archaeologist Roberto Loeras Perez, an expert on Muisca gold working and belief systems, the creation and use for Muisca metalwork was distinct in South America. No other society, as far as I know, dedicated over 50% of their production for votive offerings. I think it is quite unique, he said. The gold objects, like the collection of tunjos, votive offerings, most commonly flat anthropomorphic figures on digital display at the British Museum, were made by using the lost wax process, creating clay moulds around delicate wax models before melting them and casting them in gold. Since all the gold objects in each offering have the same chemical signature, as well as unique manufactured trays, it is clear that these objects were being specifically made for this offering and may only have been in existence for a matter of hours or days before being deposited. Incredibly, a gold raft depicting a scene exactly like that described by Juan Rodriguez Freyler was found in 1969 by 3 villagers in a small cave in the hill just to the south of Bogota. This scene of a man covered in gold going out into a sacred lake, such as Lake Guatavita, is the real story of El Dorado. The way this story grew into the myth of a legendary city of gold reveals the distinct way in which gold was a source of material wealth for European conquerors. They had little understanding of its true value within Muisca society. European minds were simply dazzled by just how much gold must have been thrown down into the deep waters of the lake and buried at other sacred sites around Colombia. In AD 1537, it was these stories of El Dorado that drew the Spanish conquistador Jimenez de Quesada and his army of 800 men away from their mission to find an overland route to Peru and up into the Andean homeland of the Muisca for the first time. Quesada and his men were lured ever deeper into alien and inhospitable territories where many lost their lives. But what Quesada and his men found astounded them, as the gold working of the Muisca was like nothing they had ever seen before. The exquisitely carved gold objects used techniques beyond anything ever seen by European eyes. Tragically, the desperate hunt for gold is still very much alive. Archaeologists working at fantastic research institutions like the Museo del Oro in Bogota are fighting against a rising tide of looting. Just like the European conquistadors of the 16th century, their modern counterparts continue to ravage South America's past and rob us of the fascinating stories behind it. The quantities of gold uncovered by these looters is still astounding. In the 1970s, when new sites were being discovered by looters in northern Colombia, it caused the world gold market to crash. This El Dorado-inspired looting of gold has meant that the vast majority of precious pre-Columbian gold objects have been melted down, and the real value of these artifacts as clues to the workings of an ancient culture has been lost forever. Fortunately, surviving collections of objects curated at the Museo del Oro in Bogota and the British Museum in London can provide an insight into these different perspectives on material value and human perception, and most importantly, tell the true story behind the myths of El Dorado. The music for today's podcast came from the musicalley.com website. The bandwidth is provided by TalkShoe at www.talkshoe.com. The show notes are kept at the Origins podcast website, www.origins.info. And remember, Origins is spelled O-R-I-G-I-N-Z. And if you'd like to find out about the progress of podcasts and other information behind them, visit me at my Facebook page at www.facebook.com/Paul Rexy, Paulrexy, or just click on the Facebook link at the show notes. And to bring the podcast to a close today, a story from the www.creepypasta.com website, and it's entitled Bedtime. Bedtime is supposed to be a happy event for a tired child. For me, it was terrifying. While some children might complain about being put to bed before they have finished watching a film or playing their favourite video game, when I was a child, nighttime was something to truly fear. Somewhere in the back of my mind, it still is. As someone who is trained in the sciences, I cannot prove that what happened to me was objectively real, but I can swear that what I experienced was genuine horror, a fear in which my life, I'm glad to say, has never been equalled. I will relate it to you all now as best I can. Make of it what you will, but I'll be glad just to get it off my chest. I can't remember exactly when it started, but my apprehension towards falling asleep seemed to correspond with my being moved into a room of my own. I was 8 years old at the time, and until then I had shared a room, quite happily, with my older brother. As is perfectly understandable for a boy 5 years my senior, my brother eventually wished for a room of his own, and as a result, I was given the room at the back of the house. It was a small, narrow, yet oddly elongated room, large enough for a bed and a couple of chest of drawers, but not much else. I couldn't really complain because even at that age I understood that we did not have a large house, and I had no real cause to be disappointed, as my family was both loving and caring. It was a happy childhood during the day. A solitary window looked out onto our back garden, nothing out of the ordinary. But even during the daylight, the light which crept into that room seemed almost hesitant. As my brother was given a new bed, I was given the bunk beds which we used to share. While I was upset about sleeping on my own, I was excited at the thought of being able to sleep in the top bunk, which seemed far more adventurous to me. From the very first night I remember a strange feeling of unease creeping slowly from the back of my mind. I lay on the top bunk, staring down at my action figures and cars strewn across the green-blue carpet. As imaginary battles and adventures took place between the toys on the floor, I couldn't help but feel that my eyes were being slowly drawn towards the bottom bunk. As impeccably made, with a dark blue blanket tucked in neatly, partially covering two rather bland white pillows. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I was a child, and the noise slipping under my door from my parents' television bathed me in a warm sense of safety and sleep hangs over your eyes and ears even when lucid. Something was moving. There was no doubt about that. At first I wasn't sure what it was. Everything was dark, almost pitch black. But there was enough light creeping in from outside to outline that narrowly suffocating room. Two thoughts appeared in my mind almost simultaneously. The first was that my parents were in bed because the rest of the house lay both in darkness and silence. The second thought turned to the noise, a noise which had obviously woken me. As the last cobwebs of sleep withered from my mind, the noise took on a more familiar form. Sometimes the simplest of sounds can be the most unnerving. A cold wind whistling through a tree outside, a neighbour's footsteps uncomfortably close, or in this case, the simple sound of bedsheets rustling in the dark. That was it. Bedsheets rustling in the dark, as if some disturbed sleeper was attempting to get too comfortable in the bottom bunk. I lay there in disbelief, thinking that the noise was either my imagination or perhaps just my pet cat finding somewhere comfortable to spend the night. It was then that I noticed my door, shut as it had been as I'd fallen asleep. Perhaps my mum had checked in on me and the cat had sneaked into my room then. Yes, that must have been it. I turned to face the wall, closing my eyes in the vain hope that I could fall back to sleep. As I moved, the rustling noise from underneath me ceased. I thought that I must have disturbed my cat, but quickly I realised that the visitor in the bottom bunk was much less mundane than my pet trying to sleep, and much more sinister. As if alerted to and disgruntled by my presence, the disturbed sleeper began to toss and turn violently, like a child having a tantrum in their bed. I could hear the sheets twist and turn with increasing ferocity. Fear then gripped me, not like the subtle sense of unease I had experienced early, but now potent and terrifying. My heart raced as my eyes panicked, scanning the almost impenetrable darkness. I let out a cry. As most young boys do, I instinctively shouted on my mother. I could hear something stir on the other side of the house, but as I began to breathe a sigh of relief that my parents were coming to save me, the bunk bed started to shake violently, as if gripped by an earthquake, scraping against the wall. I could hear the sheets below me thrashing around as if tormented by malice. I did not want to jump down to safety, as I feared the thing in the bottom bunk would reach out and grab me, pulling me into the darkness. So I stayed there, white knuckles clenching my own blanket like a shroud of protection. The wait seemed like an eternity. The door finally and thankfully burst open, and I lay bathed in light, while the bottom bunk, the resting place of my unwanted visitor, lay empty and peaceful. I cried and my mother consoled me. Tears of fear followed by relief streamed down my face. Yet through all of the horror and relief, I did not tell her why I was so upset. I cannot explain it, but it was as though whatever had been in that bunk would return, even if I so much as spoke of it, or uttered a single syllable of its existence. Whether that was the truth, I do not know, but as a child I felt as if that unseen menace remained close, listening. My mother lay in the empty bunk, promising to stay there until morning. Eventually my anxiety diminished, tiredness pushed me back towards sleep, but I remained restless, waking several times momentarily to the sound of rustling bedsheets. I remember the next day wanting to go anywhere, be anywhere, but in that narrow, suffocating room. It was a Saturday and I played outside, quite happily with my friends. Although our house was not large, we were lucky to have a long sloping garden in the back. We played there often, as much of it was overgrown and we could hide in the bushes, climb in the huge sycamore tree which towered above all else, and easily imagine ourselves in the throes of a grand adventure in some untamed, exotic land. As fun as it all was, occasionally my eye would turn to that small window, ordinary, slight and innocuous, but for me that thin boundary was a looking glass into a strange cold pocket of dread. Outside, the lush green surroundings of our garden, filled with the smiling faces of my friends, could not extinguish the creeping feeling clawing its way up my spine, each hair standing on end. The feeling of something in that room, watching me play, waiting for the night when I would be alone, eagerly filled with hate. It may sound strange to you, but by the time my parents ushered me back into that room for the night, I said nothing. I didn't protest. I didn't even make an excuse as to why I couldn't sleep there. I simply and sullenly walked into that room, climbed the few steps into the top bunk, and then waited. As an adult, I would be telling everyone about my experience, but even at that age I felt almost silly to be talking about something which I really had no evidence for. I would be lying, however, if I said this was my primary reason. I still felt that this thing would be enraged if I so much as spoke of it. It's funny how certain words can remain hidden from your mind, no matter how blatant or obvious they are. One word came to me that second night, lying there in the darkness alone, frightened, aware of a rotten change in the atmosphere, a thickening of the air as if something had displaced it. As I heard the first casual twists of the bedsheets below, the first anxious increase of my heartbeat at the realization that something was once again in the bottom bunk. That word, A word which had been sent into exile filtered up through my consciousness, free of all repression, gasping for air, screaming, etching and carving itself into my mind. Ghost. As this thought came to me, I noticed that my unwelcome visitor had ceased moving. The bedsheets lay calm and dormant, but they had been replaced by something far more hideous. A slow, rhythmic, rasping breath heaved and escaped from the thing below. I could imagine its chest rising and falling with each sordid, wheezing and garbled breath. I shuddered and hoped beyond all hope that it would leave without occurrence. The house lay as it had the previous night, in a thick blanket of darkness. Silence prevailed, all but for the perverted breath of my as yet unseen bunkmate. I lay there terrified. I just wanted this thing to go, to leave me alone. What did it want? Then something unmistakably chilling transpired. It moved. It moved in a way different from before. When it threw itself around in the bottom bunk, it seemed unrestrained, without purpose, almost animalistic. This movement, however, was driven by awareness, with purpose, with a goal in mind. For that thing lying there in the darkness, that thing which seemed intent on terrorizing a young boy, calmly and nonchalantly sat up. Its laboured breathing had become louder, and now only a mattress and a few flimsy wooden slats separated my body from the unearthly breath below. I lay there, my eyes filled with tears. A fear which mere words cannot relate to you or anyone else coursed through my veins. I would not have believed that this fear could have been heightened, but I was wrong. I imagined what this thing would look like, sitting there, listening from below my mattress, hoping to catch the slightest hint that I was awake. Imagination then turned to an unnerving reality. It began to touch the wooden slats which my mattress sat on. It seemed to caress them carefully, running what I imagined to be fingers and hands across the surface of the wood. Then with great force it prodded angrily between the two slats into the mattress. Even through the padding, it felt as though someone had viciously stuck their fingers into my side. I let out an almighty cry, and the wheezing, shaking and moving thing in the bunk below replied in kind by violently vibrating the bunk as it had done the night before. Small flakes of paint powdered onto my blanket from the wall as the frame of the bed scraped along it, backwards and forwards. Once again I was bathed in light, and there stood my mother, loving, caring as she always was, with a comforting hug and calming words which eventually subdued my hysteria. Of course, she asked me what was wrong, but I could not say. I dared not say. I simply said one word over and over and over again. Nightmare. This pattern of events continued for weeks, if not months. Night after night I would awaken to the sound of rustling sheets. Each time I would scream so as not to provide this abomination with time to prod and feel for me. With each cry the bed would shake violently, stopping with the arrival of my mother, who would spend the rest of the night in the bottom bunk, seemingly unaware of the sinister force torturing her son nightly. Along the way I managed to feign illness a few times and come up with other less than truthful reasons for sleeping in my parents' bed, but more often than not I would be alone for the first few hours of each night in that place. The room where the light from outside did not sit right, alone with that thing. With time you can become desensitized to almost anything, no matter how horrific. I had come to realize that, for whatever reason, this thing could not harm me when my mother was present. I am sure the same would have been said for my father, but as loving as he was, waking him from sleep was almost impossible. After a few months I had grown accustomed to my nightly visitor. Do not mistake this for some unearthly friendship. I detested the thing. I still feared it greatly, as I could almost sense its desires and its personality, if you could call it that. one filled with a perverted and twisted hatred, yet longing for me, of perhaps all things. My greatest fears were realised in the winter. The days grew short, and the longer nights merely provided this wretch with more opportunities. It was a difficult time for my family. My grandmother, a wonderfully kind and gentle woman, had deteriorated greatly since the death of my grandfather. My mother was trying her best to keep her in the community as long as possible. However, dementia is a cruel and degenerative illness, robbing a person of their memories, one day at a time. Soon she recognised none of us, and it became clear that she would need to be moved from my house to a nursing home. Before she could be moved, my grandmother had a particularly difficult few nights, and my mother decided that she would stay with her. As much as I loved my grandmother and felt nothing but anguish at her illness, to this day I feel guilty that my first thoughts were not of her, but of what my nightly visitor may do should it become aware of my mother's absence. Her presence being the one thing which I was sure was protecting me from the full horror of this thing's reach. I rushed home from school that day and immediately wrenched the bedsheets and mattress from the lower bunk, removing all of the slats and placing an old desk, a chest of drawers and some chairs which were kept in a cupboard where the bottom bunk used to be. I told my father I was making an office, which he found adorable, but I would be damned if I'd give that thing a place to sleep for one more night. As darkness approached, I lay there knowing my mother was not in the house. I did not know what to do. My only impulse was to sneak into her jewellery box and take a small family crucifix which I had seen there before. While my family were not very religious, at that age I still believed in God and hoped that somehow this would protect me. Although fearful and anxious while gripping the crucifix under my pillow tightly in one hand, sleep eventually came as I drifted off to dream. I hoped that I would awaken in the morning without incidents. Unfortunately, that night was the most terrifying of all. I woke gradually. The room was once again dark. As my eyes adjusted, I could gradually make out the window and the door, and the walls, some toys on a shelf, and, even to this day, I shudder to think of it, for there was no noise, no rustling of sheets, no movement at all. The room felt lifeless, yet not empty. The nightly visitor, that unwelcome, wheezing, hate-filled thing which had terrorised me night after night, was not in the bottom bunk. It was in my bed. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Utter terror had shaken the very sound from my voice. I lay motionless. If I could not scream, I did not want to let it know I was awake. I had not yet seen it. I could only feel it. It was obscured under my blanket. I could see its outline and I could feel its presence, but I dared not look. The weight of it pressed down on top of me, a sensation I will never forget. When I say that hours passed, I do not exaggerate. Laying there motionless in the darkness, I was every bit a scared and frightened young boy. If it had been during the summer months, it would have been light by then. But the grasp of winter is long and unrelenting, and I knew it would be hours before the sunrise, a sunrise which I yearned for. I was a timid child by nature, but I reached a breaking point, a moment where I could wait no more, where I could survive under this intimately deviant abomination no longer. Fear can sometimes wear you out, make you threadbare, a shell of nerves leaving only the slightest trace of you behind. I had to get out of that bed. Then I remembered the crucifix. My hand still lay underneath the pillow, but it was empty. I slowly moved my wrist around to find it, minimising as best I could the sound and vibrations caused, but it could not be found. I had either knocked it off the top bunk, or it had, I could not even bear to think of it, been taken from my hand. Without the crucifix, I lost any sense of hope. Even at such a young age, you can be acutely aware of what death is, and intensely frightened of it. I knew I was going to die in that bed if I lay there, dormant, passive, doing nothing. I had to leave that room behind, but how? Should I leap from the bed and hope that I could make it to the door? What if it's faster than me? Or should I slowly slip out of that top bunk, hoping not to disturb my uncanny bedfellow? Realising that it had not stirred when I moved, trying to find the crucifix, I began to have the strangest of thoughts. What if it was asleep? It hadn't so much as breathed since I had woken up. Perhaps it was resting, believing that it had finally got me, that I was finally in its grasp. Or perhaps it was toying with me. After all, it had been doing just that for countless nights, and now with me under it, pinned against my mattress with no mother to protect me, maybe it was holding off, savouring its victory until the last possible moment, like a wild animal savouring its prey. I tried to breathe as shallowly as possible, and mustering every ounce of courage I could, I reached over slowly with my right hand and began to peel the blanket off me. What I found under those covers almost stopped my heart. I did not see it, but as my hand moved the blanket, it brushed against something smooth and cold, something which felt unmistakably like a gaunt hand. I held my breath in terror, as I was sure it must now have known that I was awake. Nothing. It did not stir. It felt dead. After a few moments I placed my hand carefully further down the blanket and felt a thin, poorly formed forearm. My confidence and almost twisted sense of curiosity grew as I moved down further to a disproportionately larger bicep muscle. The arm was outstretched, lying across my chest, with the hand resting on my left shoulder as if it had grabbed me in my sleep. I realised that I would have to move this cadaverous appendage if I even so much as hoped to escape its grasp. For some reason the feeling of torn, ragged clothing on the shoulder of this nighttime invader stopped me in my tracks. Fear once again swelled in my stomach and in my chest as I recoiled my hand in disgust at the touch of straggled, oily hair. I could not bring myself to touch its face, although I wonder to this very day what it would have felt like. Dear God, it moved. It moved. It was subtle, but its grip on my shoulder and across my body strengthened. No tears came, but God, how I wanted to cry. As its hand and arm slowly coiled around me, my right leg brushed along the cool wall which the bed lay against. Of all that happened to me in that room, this was the strangest. I realised that this clutching, rancid thing which drew great delight from violating a young boy's bed was not entirely on top of me. It was sticking out from the wall, like a spider striking from its lair. Suddenly its grip moved from a slowly tightening to a sudden squeeze. It pulled and clawed at my clothes, as if frightened that the opportunity would soon pass. I fought against it, but its emaciated arm was too strong for me. Its head rose up, writhing and contorting under the blanket. I now realised where it was taking me, into the wall. I fought for my dear life. I cried, and suddenly my voice returned to me, yelling, screaming, but no one came. Then I realised why it was so eager to suddenly strike, why this thing had to have me now. Through my window, that window which seemed to represent so much malice from outside, streaked hope, the first rays of sunshine. I struggled further, knowing that if I could just hold on, it would soon be gone. As I fought for my life, the unearthly parasite shifted, slowly pulling itself up my chest, its head now poking out from under the blanket, wheezing, coughing, rasping. I do not remember its features. I simply remember its breath against my face, foul and as cold as ice. As the sun broke over the horizon, that dark place, that suffocating room of contempt, was washed, bathed in sunlight. I passed out as its scrawny fingers encircled my neck, squeezing the very life from me. I awoke to my father offering to make me some breakfast. A wonderful sight indeed. I had survived the most horrible experience of my life until then, and now. I moved the bed away from the wall, leaving behind the furniture I had believed would stop that thing from taking a bed. Little did I think that it would try to take mine and me. Weeks passed without incidents, yet on one cold, frost-bitten night I awoke to the sound of the furniture where the bunk beds used to be, vibrating violently. In a moment it passed. I lay there sure I could hear a distant wheezing coming from deep within the wall, finally fading into the distance. I have never told anyone this story before. To this day I still break out in a cold sweat at the sound of bedsheets rustling in the night, or a wheeze brought on by a common cold, and I certainly never sleep with the bed against a wall. Call it superstition if you will, but as I said, I cannot discount conventional explanations such as sleep paralysis, hallucination, or that of an overactive imagination. But what I can say is this. The following year I was given a larger room on the other side of the house, and my parents took that strangely suffocating, elongated place as their bedroom. They said they didn't need a large room, just one big enough for a bed and a few things. They lasted 10 days. We moved on the 11th. And that story is from Michael Whitehouse. Good night. Sleep tight, everyone. If you can. Bye for now.